today with Peter Barber. I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which I am, the lands of Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. I am Georgios Stojanovic, Senior Lecturer here at the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning, and our guest today, Peter Barber. I don't know if you can see him already or not. I hope you can. I'll just make a very quick introduction and then I'll be out of your way. So Peter is a Soane Medal recipient. There are many other awards to his name. He's widely regarded as one of the most distinctive architects in the UK, responsible for a number of intriguing housing projects in London and elsewhere. I got to know his work through Donnybrook Quarter project around 2001. It was an international competition with a very big number of entries. Peter has won and then went on to build that project. And then from there on, there were quite a few other projects. So today he'll speak about his practice. I think we've agreed to speak about another more recent project also in East London. And if we have time, we'll allow questions, hopefully coming in through a chat box. We'll see if we manage our way toward the end, and if we have time. So, as I promised, very quick introduction, leaving Peter to speak to you.
Great. All right. Well, thank you very much, Georgios, and thank you very much everybody for coming. I am going to show you some pictures of our work, as you perhaps expect. But before I do that, I'd like to share with you some of the context in which we're working. There may be parallels in Melbourne, in Australia, and also to talk a little bit about some of the politics and the ideology which underpins our decision-making in the design process. I will share my screen now, and let's see where this takes us. I'll talk for about 45 minutes, and then we can perhaps have some questions or something. Right, so this is a march that we went on a few years ago, and it shows just how much trouble we are in London. There are currently 7,000 people living on the streets in the gutter of our city. London, one of the richest cities the world's ever known. There are a further 30,000 people living in insecure accommodation, classed by homeless charities, also classed as homeless. This is a consequence of the mismanagement of the land economy and housing production by successive governments over many decades, really since the 70s. It wasn't always like that. In the aftermath of the Second World War, nearly half the population of the UK enjoy the benefits of living in social housing, inexpensively in social housing. But in 1977, Margaret Thatcher introduced a housing bill which enabled residents in social housing to buy their own properties at a discounted price. It prevented local authorities from building social housing. And this proud tradition, which in the aftermath of the Second World War, we were building 150,000 social homes a year, this proud tradition was ended, and successive governments of both political complexions have been a party to this process, in which housing has become, rather than basic infrastructure, has become commodity, investment vehicle, both for us as individuals, but also for big money, big finance, global capital. And I suspect this is a kind of scenario that feels familiar to you as well. So most visible is the manner in which government has been actually demolishing social housing, in addition to selling some of it off. And our Prime Minister, the Conservative Prime Minister of 2016, said this, and it's a helpful caption to this picture: "Post-war estates across the country are ripe for redevelopment. We will sweep away the planning blockages and take new steps to reduce political and reputational risk for projects' key decision makers and investors." That's very sinister. It's kind of removing the politics and removing the sort of blame that ought to go on the people who are doing this. I believe that together, this is David Cameron again, I believe that together we can tear down anything that stands in our way, and tear it down they have. And in some cases, it's being replaced by this, which is vast swathes of London where demolition is being enacted. This is South London, this is Battersea Power Station, and vast amounts of, again, global capital coming in and building shiny new turnkey developments, many of them empty. There are 30,000 empty homes in London, you know, really criminal in the context of the homeless problem that we have. And this is the consequence. This is a photograph taken in a subway a few hundred yards from Apsley House and in Buckingham Palace. And it's to our shame, our shared shame. We live in a democracy. We're not just architects, we're citizens. And we're allowing this to go on. This is somebody's bedroom. It's a picture taken by a homeless person as part of a project that a friend of mine ran, where people were given disposable cameras and invited to take a picture of their own environment. And this is somebody else's flat. This is a one-bedroom flat in Knightsbridge, which sold for £10 million. And so it's a question really of, of resources not being allocated equally, and really, really shocking. Elsewhere in the country, there are areas which have become depopulated as a result of sort of post-industrial, the decline of industry, you know, beautiful streets of beautiful Victorian housing, which is just boarded up and empty. And countrywide, I said London, there's 30,000. Countrywide, there are more like 300,000 empty homes. So, I mean, that's the sort of political context in which we're working. I think there are three things government could do to end the housing crisis quite rapidly. One is to reintroduce a proper social housing program of the scale that we were able to achieve. Actually, when this country was broke after the Second World War, we managed to build a health service and we managed to build 150,000 homes a year. And I think that's what we should be doing. Social homes, that is, council houses. And I think we should be doing that again. I think we should end the right to buy. They've done it in Scotland and Wales. It remains a thing in England, so that every time we build a house, within months, people put in a request to buy it and they can do so at a reduced rate and then flog it on. And then the other thing I'd like to see is rent controls, which put together with the other two strands of policy, which I think would be good, I think would quite rapidly remove the problem. So that's, as I say, the context in which we're working. And this brings me to a more sort of conventionally architectural bit of the talk, in which I want to talk about cities and the relationship between people and space. I think it's a fascinating relationship. On the one hand, we build our cities, we make them, and then they come back and impact and make us, and they sort of frame societal relations. This is a idea that's captured very beautifully in a book called One Way Street, written in the late 1920s by the great Walter Benjamin. And in it, he describes, in each chapter of One Way Street, it's worth a look, a fantastic book. In each chapter, he describes a different European city. And it's his description of the city of Naples which really captures my imagination. This photograph is the city of Naples. And he's talking about a city which is permeable, one which invites occupation, one which bursts into life as people occupy it, and the color of their lives are overlaid onto the architecture, and in a way the architecture becomes a backdrop and something which is less important than what's going on in it. And he puts it like this: the passion for improvisation, so he's describing Naples, the passion for improvisation demands that space and opportunity be at any price preserved. Buildings are used as a popular stage. They're all divided into innumerable, simultaneously animated theatres. Balcony, courtyard, window, gateway, staircase, roof are at the same time stages and boxes. So it's the theatre of the city. We're, on the one hand, we're kind of observers, we're an audience, but also we are the actors and framed by this incredible street scene. As porous as the stone is the architecture. Buildings and action interpenetrate in the courtyards, arcades and stairways. In everything, they preserve the scope to become a theatre of new, unforeseen constellations. The stamp of the definitive is avoided. No situation appears intended forever. So when we're designing our buildings, when we're designing our housing, we, again, confronted with blank sheet of paper, one is constantly trying to imagine what kind of social activity, what kind of cultural activity might be framed by these spaces, might be encouraged by these spaces. And the Walter Benjamin quote is a really helpful reminder of that, and something we refer back to a great deal. This is a street close to home. This is in Brighton in the south of England. And, you know, I think streets are fascinating things. You might say, well, we all know what a street is. Why is he talking about streets? But I think sometimes the most familiar things are worth looking at. So a city like London, and I'm sure it may well be the same for Melbourne, 70% of all of the buildings in our city are houses. So houses are what the city is made of. It's what compresses public social activity into narrow spaces. When buildings push people together in this way, it's what surrounds our squares. So when we're designing our housing, we're thinking about it from an urban perspective. This street's obviously quite an extreme example, but it's a fascinating space because it's a space that has a multitude of different functions on it. There are pubs, there are shops, there are people living up above. It's never really empty. And even when it is quiet at nighttime, there are people on the upper floors looking over into the space of the street. And so you never feel alone and always feel kind of relatively safe. The street also is a fantastic means by which we can navigate the street. The city, if you think of interwar planning, in which buildings, certainly in London, I don't know, maybe true in Melbourne as well, in which large buildings are dropped down into large open spaces. There are very few clues about the navigation of the city, but with streets in a well-integrated, connected street layout, it's easy to find your way around. The street's also a fantastic condenser. It brings people from all sorts of different backgrounds into a single space, different racial groups, different age groups, different socio-economic groups. And so in its way, a street can play its part in making a city better integrated, bringing people together, making them known to one another. And by contrast, the sort of gated city, which is a growing phenomenon in much of the Western world and all over the world, is a city which tends to separate and segregate and ghettoize people. So I'm for a street-based city. I don't think there's a really better way of organizing cities or organizing housing for that matter. And you'll see that as we progress into our work. This is an image which reminds me just to mention public space. I think public space is an extraordinary and fascinating thing. And again, you might say, well, we know what public space is, so why is he talking about it? But again, it's space in which people are brought together. This is a wonderful example in Marrakesh. It's called Jama Al Fana. And in the cool of the evening, for the last 1,000 years, the city, a dense city of alleyways, is disgorged into this space of an evening, where storytellers and temporary kitchens and snake charmers and all sorts of people come into public space and share the experience. Public space is extraordinary, isn't it? It belongs to everybody, but it belongs to nobody as well. And this reading of public space as a space which kind of is a great leveler, which brings people together, is reinforced by the name of this particular public space, which is Jama Al Fana, which means a mosque of nothing. And I love the idea of public space being a mosque of nothing, a space in which ideology is kind of what you want it to be. You can be who you want to be. And there are, clearly rules, but the rules are relatively open and people can behave as they will. So this incredible scene of ephemeral architecture, half the time made of people themselves who create circles around events and storytellers and musicians, has gone on night after night, as I said, for generations. Behind the photographer in this picture is the Grand Mosque of Marrakesh, and if this is the Mosque of Nothing, then the then Jama Al Fana, the Mosque of Nothing, has its antithesis in the mosque itself, a building which has stood there for, say, about 1,000 years, also meter-thick walls. And if this is about a space of ever-changing and ephemeral architecture, the mosque itself symbolizes an unchanging and fixed ideology in its counterpoint. I want to talk a tiny bit about our office. So this is us. We're in North London, in King's Cross. And I really love the idea of having a shop front, which is our kind of where we share our work with our neighborhood. And we constantly get people knocking on the door and saying what's going on, and from tourists to local people to homeless people. There's a hostel around the corner, and I think it's really incredible to have this kind of presence within the city itself, something which we take quite seriously. Here's our meeting room. We're a small office. There's only varying between 5 and 9 of us. So we box above our weight, really, but it's a very long-standing team who really know their stuff, and it's a very efficient and kind of effective way of working. You can see we make models, physical models. We don't think that computer models do the job properly. And so while some of these are presentation models, many of them are working models, which we make with scalpels, not with machines. So we can hack bits off, and it's a really important part of our design process. I don't know of any other way of effectively designing a building, because as I said, I don't believe that computer models tell you what you need to know. It's a social scene as well, our office. It's been described as less of an architect's office and more of a dinner party. So this is where we have our lunches, but we also go out to the pub on a Friday and we celebrate, lunch, celebrate birthdays with kind of shared lunches and things like that. So that's an important part of our world. And this is the current group in front of one of our housing schemes, which I'll describe later in the talk. The other really important component of our creative process is the sketch. And again, I don't think SketchUp or computer models do what these can do. None of these are presentation drawings. They're all drawings done in the process of in the design process on yellow paper. I'm still very much at the helm when it comes to designing, and layer after layer of yellow paper are laid onto a site plan till eventually drawings like this begin to emerge and we begin to understand what this thing is three-dimensionally. So we move backwards and forwards between sketches and between models very, very rapidly. It's a very dynamic process, and I don't believe, again, that the computer can have that sort of dynamism and physicality, which we were able to have in ours. There's a kind of urban design model of a large scheme in East London, showing the kind of streets and squares, rather in the manner which I've described, compressing public space, but also understanding the massing of the project and how spaces between buildings are shaping up. Then we move on to a larger scale model where we're able to show fenestration and look at things in a little bit more detail. And finally, on a sort of unit basis, a larger scale, 1 to 50, typically foam core models where we can start to see the interiors and the relationship between the interiors, the street and the courtyards which we're designing. So this is the first of the built projects I'm going to show you, and it's Donnybrook Quarter. It's a competition we won, 20 or 25, maybe 30 years ago, 25 years ago. And it was a housing competition, and it's obviously the square rectangle in the middle. But we encouraged the judges to think of this housing project in urban terms. And we said in the center of our design boards for the competition, this scheme is a celebration of the public social life of the street. And you can see here a left to right street and a kind of north to south street. And where they intersect, the project opens out into a little public square at the center. The urban narrative was nothing to do with the competition. It's something that we added in. And most of the other competitions entries put a fence around this site and built an apartment building in the middle. But we made it a piece of the city, so that if you look at the north to south route, you can see a street coming in from the top and going through our scheme and into the bottom. So essentially, it's a very public spirited proposal, which kind of taps into some of the things I was talking about at the opening part of this talk. You can see it in 3 dimensions here. The cross-site streets there, and then these peculiar units. Now, what these are, that isn't a whole house, that's 2 units. That front door, the blue front doors lead into a ground floor home, and the gates next to them lead into an upper maisonette. So it's a sort of double stack unit. But the point here is that there's no common area circulation. The street itself is the circulation of the project, and the possibility of people's getting to know their neighbours, or at least recognise them by sight in a street or on a square, it seems to me is much more likely than on a corridor or in a lift or on a deck access in a shared apartment block. So that's the benefit that this proposal, this idea, this typology, the double stack typology brings. The other benefit from a developer's point of view is they're not building loads of common area circulation, which needs to be paid for. And typically an apartment block has 20 to 25% staircases, lifts, corridors which need to be paid for to be built. So in a £5 million project, £1 million quid's going into building corridors, lifts and staircases. And then it also doesn't have to be cleaned and maintained in the long run. So social and economic benefits to doing housing like this. People were anxious about the fact that these buildings opened these homes directly out onto the street because it wasn't the orthodoxy of the time. People talked about defensible space, but my view on that has always been defense against what? Against your neighbors. And this is my own house down in Brighton. And the possibility that people start to appropriate the space at the front of their home and something rather magic starts to happen as the distinction between private space of the interior and the public space of the pavement start to overlap. And this isn't a new invention, these double stack units. This is the Edwardian version in South London, where one front door leads into a ground floor home and the other front door next to it leads into the flat above. So they are flats, but they kind of feel like houses. The other thing that people were anxious about at Donnybrook was the roof terraces that we were creating. And again, we were able to take them down. I'm a great one for looking at precedent. We were taken down to South London to a place called Pullens Buildings. It's a really, really amazing place. And these are all roof terraces woven into the sort of courtyards of the top floor units. And we were able to kind of reassure our clients with images of this project. So there it is, on the day of completion, rather gleaming white and a bit kind of dead. But nevertheless, you can see what's going on here. There is a very intimate relationship, as I said, between the street and the homes themselves, to the extent that the homes actually hang out over the street with these oriel windows, which become like display cabinets. And in the fullness of time, people have put ornaments and flower arrangements and all sorts. And on the sort of these balconies, which are a secondary outside space, the principal outside space is the courtyards at first floor level. These balconies, which are a place for you to come out to in your dressing gown and have your first cigarette of the day or whatever you want to do off those balconies. It's a project which has repetition in it. You can see it on the left-hand side along this street, but it's a project which also kind of recognized the picturesque or cinematic way of thinking about architecture, in which special moments like this corner we make a special fuss of with this curve. And the idea that as you move through the building, views like this open up. So again, a kind of cinematic way of thinking about architecture. Right. Right, I'm getting it's not letting me, oh, there we go. So again, here we have a view along the backs of these buildings, which are very close together. Typically, terraced housing of this sort has to be 20 meters apart in this city because of privacy notions, sort of post-war functionalist planning notions of privacy. So how it works at Donnybrook is that the upper units are all swiveled through 90 degrees and look sideways, each into their own private courtyard. And the lower units are separated visually by this wall that runs down the middle of the block. So privacy is maintained. And we're able to get quite high densities with this typology because, as I say, we're able to move the buildings much closer together than we would in normal terraced housing. And it's really heartwarming to go back there and see people moving in and the greenery emerging in these spaces, the courtyards, which we've created. At front doors, so I had the clever idea of putting windows in all the front doors, which was not so clever actually, because people, so that people could see their visitors as they came to the front door. Of course, nobody wants to be seen when they go to the front door. Hence the prevalence of those little kind of spy holes that people get. So what's happened at Donnybrook, and to my delight, is that everybody in every single house, every time I've been there, has put a little picture in their window and which says something about them. And I think that's a really lovely thing and something to be celebrated. And it just goes to show you can't predict. Architecture doesn't have a causal kind of effect on the way people behave. We as architects can't know what's going to happen. And sometimes nice surprises occur. So the second project I want to show you is about back-to-back housing. It's housing which has no back gardens at all. So the space at the front of the building becomes the most important. And again, one's looking to precedent, and I'm very reassured if I find something that works like this. So these are Victorian houses which have no back gardens. They have they're called blind backs. There are no windows at the back. So the people who live here invest everything in the space at the front of their house with rather beautiful effects and miraculous effects. And it's something that I thought was worth thinking about and exploring in the project which we did at McGrath Road. Here it is. In the center, the space with the green dots in it is a courtyard in the middle. Around the two sides, to the left and the bottom, are street frontages. And so there are houses which face out into the street, and there are other houses which are immediately behind them, with no back gardens, which face into the courtyard in the middle. This again is a place with no common area circulation. They're all houses. So again, you can see the street corner and a row of houses facing out onto the street, and another row of houses facing into the little tree-lined courtyard. And there are arches at the right-hand end and the left-hand end leading into that courtyard. Each of the four-story houses has a kitchen on the ground floor, a bedroom, and then a living room on the top floor, where they have the use of this little private courtyard. So back-to-back housing was a form of housing typology which was very, very common, particularly in the north of England during the Industrial Revolution, when people arrived in their hordes into cities like Liverpool and Hull and Sheffield. During this rapid expansion, low-cost housing was required, and the idea of building back-to-back was sort of the dominant thing. There are very few left. Most of these areas have been demolished as slum housing, but I visited one fragment of back-to-back housing in Birmingham, where there used to be 30,000, there are now 8, and they have been saved by a charity and restored. And I was anxious about proposing a type of housing which has effectively been outlawed as slum housing, but going there made me feel very reassured by what I found. And I thought if one could deal with some of the issues of Victorian back-to-back housing, i.e. giving people their own bathroom rather than shared bathrooms, then this was a really admirable and interesting way of doing housing. Very efficient in terms of materials, because the net to gross, the floor area ratio to external wall is very efficient, because 3 sides are shared with other homes. And as I say, also efficient from the point of view of heat loss. So there it is. We were very interested because of this lack of back garden, that the front of these houses we should make a fuss at the front of these houses, hence these arches. We viewed them as being a little bit like the stoop or porch that they have in the southern states of America. I don't know if you have them in Australia, as being a kind of interface again between the private space of the house itself and the pavement. There it is again, and there's the central courtyard. There's the kitchen on the ground floor, and the living room on the top floor, 2 bedrooms in between. These houses aren't for everybody, and I think the idea that there's one size fits all for housing is quite wrong. One of the problems that we have are very sort of draconian laws about housing standards. The kitchen should be this big, the bedroom should be this big, the relationship between them should be this relationship. And I think, you know, the houses at McGrath Road are a very good illustration of the fact that, you know, a house over 3 or 4 stories with 1 room per floor would suit somebody with good knees. A house where you are right on the pavement suits somebody who likes their idea of knowing their neighbours. But this certainly isn't true of everybody. And so I think design standards which try and push us all in the same direction in doing housing doesn't acknowledge that. McGrath Road is a very particular type of housing, but the people who do have chosen to live there are really loving it, as evidenced by the way, you know, these spaces at the front and on the balconies are being used. And I actually posted this picture on the internet 6 months ago, and the woman up there responded by saying, it's so good of you to post this. This house, which I'm sharing with my 2 small children, has transformed our lives. They love playing out in the courtyard. And it's very lovely to hear that from people. Another more sort of sophisticated, kind of like Mediterranean frontage. and a nice messy one. So lots of architects really hate it when people mess up their sort of clean spaces, but I, like Walter Benjamin, feel that this is when architecture becomes important and significant, and when it, you know, gets overlaid with people's lives, with their stuff. That's when it gets fun. So this brings me to our most recent project. We get given some rubbish sites, we really do. They're often by railway lines, kind of unloved bits of the city. This one, though, is kind of one of the worst. It's the curve of this block on the right-hand side follows the curve of the North Circular Road, which is a street which is, it's not really a street, it's a kind of motorway which runs around in circles London, constantly choked with traffic. So on the other side, the site follows a kind of zigzag line, where it shares a boundary with some rather large suburban houses. The site was bought by, in the first instance, by Transport for London, who are in charge of the infrastructure of the city, of the road infrastructure and rail infrastructure of the city, as a road widening scheme, which they didn't in the end do. This was about 30 years ago. And so about 2 years ago, sold back to the private sector. My client bought this site, a very incredibly unpromising and difficult site. There are the cars on the right-hand side whizzing up and down along the motorway. But our proposal creates a wall against the motorway of buildings 4 and 5 stories high, and a little mews. The grey is a mews which runs down parallel to the motorway, and on the other side of the mews are some lower buildings which back onto the existing houses behind. Each of these is a little apartment building, a little walk-up apartment building, and on the ends, these taller buildings are bigger apartment buildings with a lift and a staircase, very efficiently planned, with one or two, no more than 1 or 2 flats per floor. The right-hand building, which is protecting everybody from the motorway, is 1 room deep. Critically, importantly, it's only 1 room deep, so that every room within this right-hand building can open a window into the mews. And when you're in this mews, you'd never know that the North Circular was there. You could hear a pin drop in there, and our strategy has absolutely paid dividends. We've got 100 homes here. When the site was initially sold, it was believed that it would be 50 homes, and I think I suspect that people were anticipating doing 3 point blocks, 3 apartment buildings dotted through this space. But our strategy of building homes against the motorway and protecting the site has enabled us to get double that number to 100. And there it is. It's always a kind of bit of a miracle when you go from that to that, and I'm not pretending it's easy, but it is incredible process, isn't it? So this is the kind of quite heroic side of the project. Despite the fact that it's creating a wall to the road, it is a very sort of positive backdrop to the road, and one imagines a world one day when these are all electric cars, and some of the issues which are currently represented by this road are no longer the case. Those boxes are actually bathrooms hanging out over the street. But by contrast, the space behind has a much more domestic vibe to it, and greenery starting to emerge in this space. Apparently there are kids out there on a weekend playing badminton. I need to get back down there and get some more photographs. But as I say, you'd never know the main road was there, and all the people in the right-hand block can open windows onto this space for ventilation. And as I say, the end building, a kind of taller little apartment building at the end, and a little cafe on the ground floor. I think this is probably the last of the built projects. This is a homeless hostel in North London, in Kentish Town, for those who know London at all. And this is the hostel building, which is a Victorian building with a sort of Dutch gable kind of architecture. The council were very happy for us to knock this down, but we said it's nice, let's keep it. But we did demolish these buildings at the back here. So the building fronts the road at the top, and we retained that principal building, but these lower, some single-story and 1.5-story buildings were removed because we felt there was something a little bit more magical that could be done at the back here. This is how homeless hostels usually feel when you're inside them. They are housing some of the most vulnerable and often troubled and disturbed people in our society. And this is how very often they are getting to their room. But we wondered about another idea. We wondered about the idea that the main hostel on the left, that this very deep site might explore the possibility of a central garden with houses, little tiny weeny cottages all around the edge, giving people that little bit of separation from one another, but also a connection with one another in the garden. Slightly, well, very much deinstitutionalizing the hostels so that it becomes a space in which people have a bit of privacy, their own bathroom, their own shower room, I should say, their own kitchenette, but also the support that comes from a shared space like a garden. It's part of a program funded by central government in which hostels which had been hitherto underfunded and really kind of, in many cases, really awful kind of doss houses became much more like kind of hotels. So you arrive at the reception desk on the left-hand side, and the space and sort of generosity in the way that they are entered. Very often, traditionally, you entered through a sort of airlock system of tiny spaces for security. This is what the reception into a homeless hostel, one of our homeless hostels, looks like now. And this is how our scheme at Holmes Road emerged. And we had the idea of this garden, not just an ornamental garden, but the idea of a garden which would be for the use of residents, and the idea that it might be a productive garden. So each one of those coloured doors is a door into an individual house. People with higher support needs remain in the main hostel on the left-hand side under the kind of watchful eye of residents, of staff who can be supportive. But people doing better have that bit of independence. And I did that drawing before I went to meet the council. And let's remind ourselves that this is what's possible with public money by a local authority who have the interests of the most vulnerable people at heart. It doesn't happen in all councils. Many of them ship people out, boroughs ship people out into other areas to get rid of them. But Camden Council take very seriously their obligations, their responsibilities to our fellow citizens who are struggling. And when I showed them this picture, and again, the gardens formed no part of any kind of brief, but we said we thought it'd be a fantastic thing to have a sort of therapeutic garden in which people could work and to be encouraged out of their rooms. Very often people in this situation sit in the darkness of a room with the curtains shut, that this might be a very positive addition to the brief. And I read them a piece of writing, which I'm going to read to you. This is, you're in a room full of pretty hard-nosed, servants of the borough, people who are kind of used to a pretty uninspiring environment. There's somebody reversing their vehicle outside. Sorry about that. Anyway, I read this to them, and these sort of grey bureaucrats' kind of eyes lit up. We imagine a group of residents working with a gardener to create and maintain an intensely planted and beautiful garden with an apple tree or two, potatoes, green veg, soft fruit, herbs, a greenhouse, a potting shed, and a sunny spot to sit and rest. So that shed there is not a sort of garden shed, it's a place that people can sit and have a kind of counselling session. We think there ought to be a little room or shed in the garden for private chats and counselling. Conceived as the social heart of the hostel, the garden creates a homely, domestic atmosphere. It gives participating residents an interest and an outlet for their energy, helping to foster a sense of belonging, self-worth, and empowerment. And so this, as what happened, this kind of got built as we went into COVID. And so the gardening project is only just getting going now. This is a photograph taken of it on completion, and it stayed like this for a couple of years. And I need to go up there and get some pictures of the project as it starts to develop into a garden. This is another hostel, actually, one we've done before, which also has a gardening project. And it's just lovely to see the guys and the women get out there and start to make a connection, not just with the garden, but with one another in working and shaping their own environment. They've got a sort of fantastic sense of empowerment and a kind of very sociable situation. Each one of the houses is absolutely tiny. I mean, I'm tall and I can virtually touch the walls on either side. It's only a little bit over 2 meters wide. Tiny kitchenette on the ground floor, a table and chair, a shower room at the back of the plan, and then stairs up onto a space for a single bed and sort of double height space underneath an arched roof. And again, the model. And again, just elation really to see it when these places are actually constructed. This is a photograph taken very early in the morning when the sun was almost horizontal and the reflection of windows on one side of the courtyard reflected onto the doors opposite. This is the final little bit of the talk, which is I teach, and I'm involved. My involvement of academia is absolutely central to the work of my practice. It's a space in which I can dream in a way that I can't dream quite so much, or nearly so much, within the office environment. So I kind of live in my sketchbooks, and I did a project to test myself a little bit, and I failed actually. It's called 1 Year, 365 Cities, and I just decided to try and design a city a day for a year. And here are some of the examples. I got to about 180 and then frankly got a little bit bored and slightly ran out of ideas, but not before I got quite a lot of them done. And a mud city in the top left hand side of the project in Surrey in the south of England, a subterranean courtyard city in the middle and the top. I don't need to go through them, but I just think to sketch and to dream, and to still to be doing that at 62 is a really important component, a really important part, a really important thread to run through one's sort of architectural life. And somebody in the office made some lovely cast models of a few of them. And some of these very quick projects, I promised myself I'd only take 5 minutes on each one, turned into a bit of a bigger idea, turned into more like a 5-week project. Difficult to resist when you have something which you think is looking fun. This is the idea of an island, the white is water, an island in the River Thames, constructed out of aggregate dredged from the bottom of the river, and that people might be it might be a fishing village on the Thames for 50 or 80 so houses. And this is the final project. It's another of these 1 year 365 projects, and another one 1 year 365 cities projects, and another one which kind of got hold of me and I couldn't let it go. It's the idea of a city encircling London, and if London is being demolished progressively, central areas of London, social housing, what might be a better place actually to put if we need millions of new houses, what might be a better place to put them? And my idea was that they'd be built into the last 100 yards or so, 100 meters or so of suburbia, and that we might demolish a few bungalows at the edge of London to make a dense, intense city of houses, but also schools and factories, creating an edge to our city and an edge to a newly productive countryside. So the area to the bottom of this picture, these are fields, and the top is suburbia, and that peculiar line running along the top of our city is a monorail. And woven into this are courtyards and streets. And I'm going to read you what I've said about this, and then we'll be nearly there. And the point, I think, is that the circumference of London is 100 miles. So this is a city that would wrap right around London, and in so doing, create all these millions of homes. 100-mile city. Build a street-based linear city, 100 miles long, 100 meters wide and 4 stories high. Wrap it around London. Give it little factories, schools, houses and shops, laid out in terraces along intimately scaled streets and around squares. Make it a dense, intense edge to London, a confident, purposeful boundary fronting a revitalized, productive countryside. 100-mile city is a linear Barceloneta, a circular Rome, a stretched Porto, suburbia reprogrammed, hybridized, compressed, catalytic urbanism en fleek. Ride the 100-mile high-speed orbital monorail, souped-up Skyfly Circle Line, the loose ends and frayed edges of London's transport system, its isolated city edge train and bus termini, instantly, meaningfully, usefully connected with circus ride technology. Bexley to Brentford in 40 minutes, super functional, super fast, and super fun. London has a brilliant train rail system. It is radial out from the center. The idea that one might connect all of those with a monorail is an interesting sort of strand to this project and a really important part of it. It's not just about building housing, it's about developing the infrastructure which makes it usable, functional, and as I said, fun. And the idea is that this ring, rather than spreading out into the green belt, which is what we shouldn't be doing, is that it might spread inwards into the city so that the outer areas of our London become densified. And in time, watch our city grow inwards, spreading like a wildfire through wasteful, antisocial, car-choked suburbia. Eastwards from Richmond, west across the Newham marshes, up from Eltham, across the hills of Greenwich and the empty green swards and golf courses of Enfield. Metroland consolidated, backfilled, integrated and urbanized. London for 40 million people. A kind of inside-out plan voisin, Ville Radieuse Blighty style. Some of the urban blocks that we made this cast plaster model. Again, sketches of what we think it could be like. And there we are. So that's my talk. I'm going to stop sharing the screen if I can do that. There we are.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you. Thanks very much. I'm just going to jump in, and if you prefer to have a glass of water or just make a quick break, we still have over 100 people on the other side of the line, and there are some questions in for you. I don't know if you want to turn on a Q&A function. There's a button there. You'll see it.
Oh yeah. Oh, I see. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And maybe just pick one or two that you'd like to answer. Maybe we don't have time for all of them, but just one or two that you fancy. Maybe we can address.
Okay. Car parking. We do car parking. There's the requirements for car parking varying between boroughs, and we do whatever we need to do, whether it's sort of underground car parking but generally it's street-based car parking. We don't do backland parking lots. We think the car should be part of the project, and people going to and from their cars is what happens in cities, and that's our approach. The Victorian typology, a lot of our projects rework Victorian typologies. And the reason for doing that is that I think that many of the modernist experiments with housing are anti-urban, and there are numerous house types, and I've shown some of them, which we can learn from Victorian architects and to Victorian planners. So I showed back-to-back housing, I showed double stack housing, but when we do apartment buildings, they're more like the mansion block typology, which unlike a modernist block, which tends to sit in the middle of space and do nothing urbanistically, our mansion blocks and the type that we borrow from the Victorian apartment type tend to front the street and make the street. I don't know if you're familiar with kind of Edwardian and Victorian mansion blocks, and I haven't included any examples of our work doing that in this talk, but you'll notice that the project doesn't look like Victorian architecture, but I'm just really comfortable reworking some of these kind of forgotten types in the aftermath of the great modernist experiment of the interwar period, and understanding many of the advantages that these forms of housing bring from a social perspective. What else have we got?
There's a lot of thank you notes as well, which you can skim through. There's a question whether or not we will have the recording available. The answer is yes to that one, if Peter agrees. So it should be publicly available after this.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I mean, there's a mention here, anonymous attendee talks about Alvaro Caesar. Caesar is a great architect and a tremendous influence, and his experiments with terraced housing in Porto and Evora were an inspiration, as are many of the sort of, I talked about some of the traditional precedents of our work, but the work of Alvaro Caesar, Louis Barragan, some of the aesthetics sort of dimensions of our work, and indeed some of the early modernism. So Corbusier, in his earlier work in Bordeaux, was doing terraced forms of terraced housing. So one has an affection for some of those projects as well. Well, there's a thing about Balfron Tower and the displacement of social residents, even where some of these modernist blocks are refurbished. They're very often not refurbished for their original residents. People are moved out, and you know, particularly where they're well known and beautifully designed pieces of modernism, they become you know, high end, high cost housing, which to me is an absolutely travesty of their original intention, and it's happening all over London, probably all over the world for that matter, but certainly it's a big issue for us in London, and it's not the sort of project I'd want to get involved with, but unfortunately there are plenty of people who are happy to do that. How do you decide the balance between green space and sealed open space? Do you interview potential residents? Well, the issue of interviewing potential residents is a tricky one. One would love to be working in an environment in which the means of production of housing made it much more easy for us to be connected with potential residents. Unfortunately, Karl Marx once said we're a stranger to the things that we make. He was talking about the division of labor, and perhaps a lot of architects working on large scale housing projects in Australia feel the same way. We're rather separate from the ultimate end user by the means of production. And again, it would be lovely to have a closer connection with those people, and maybe after the revolution that'll be easier. But right now, with an overheated and commodified housing system, we tend to be rather separated from the people who we are working for. And I suppose the best one can hope for, as I said earlier on in the talk, that there are lots of different types of housing in our work, and we've shown some here to suit different sorts of people. And that, I think, is the best that we can do, is to say that there are houses for people who would like to feel rather separate. There are houses for people who like a bigger garden. There are houses for people who don't have time for gardening, so there's a little roof terrace. Yeah. What else have we got here? Sorry if I'm skimming past your question.
There's a good one on adaptive reuse of existing buildings. Is this something that interests you?
Absolutely. And as I said, on the Holmes Road homeless project, we were invited by the council to knock the whole lot down. And where possible, we always try to keep substantial buildings. I can't see any benefit in knocking buildings down, and I can only see benefits in retaining buildings, except in very extreme circumstances. So, I mean, it's still a hostel. We haven't changed that, but you know, greatly increasing insulation in the roof of that project, and in the walls, and in double glazing the place, and adding means by which we can generate energy on the site, all form part of that project. And I love working with existing buildings, even ones which are slightly problematic, because they're actually the challenge of changing them a little bit. Particularly, you know, we're working on housing estates, sometimes which are quite kind of slightly poorly laid out. They're creating ghettos, sort of interwar planners, again, rather likes the idea of creating little enclaves and backwaters, sometimes with disastrous impact. The instinct of many architects is to say, right, we're going to knock it all down. For us, it's about much more like a surgical intervention, where we might remove a couple of homes to sort of thread a new route through, and to improve the homes from an urbanistic perspective that way, but also to improve them from the heat loss perspective and so on. What else? Can you see any other ones?
Yeah, there's one on the trajectory of your practice, asking, you know, what happened after Donnybrook Quarter. You decided to stay small practice. I mean, it sounds like it was a self-conscious decision. And is this the way how you see the practice moving on? Yeah, I mean, I've worked for practices which started at 10 and ended up 30 and lost something in the process. I think if you can't get round a table, then something big changes. So 8, 10, 12 people, maybe, if you can't sit in a restaurant together, something changes. And you know, I'm sitting here chatting to you, but there's
well, they're all on holiday at the moment, but usually there's 6 or 8 other people sitting back in the office who are fantastically talented individuals who have close relationships and therefore are able to kind of share work, and we work terribly efficiently. And so I remember early on people used to ask, how many people have you got working for you? And for me, a mark of success was it being a small number, not a big number. And I've managed to keep hold of the design process, keep control of the design process. I think if there were 20 or 30 people, I'd be kind of losing control of that. But you know, who knows? And the other extraordinary thing is, but by being a really efficient group of and smart group of people, we can get a heck of a lot done. I don't think many people know that it's quite so small as that.
Okay. Maybe we leave it at that, Peter. It's getting quite late, and you know, there's a ricochet of questions of all sorts. So you did very well to answer.
And there's a football match on, I hear, as well.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, we just maybe we can make it for the second half. Thank you so much for finding time for us. It was a real pleasure having you virtually in Melbourne, and we certainly hope to see you sometime in person. Thank you so much for your time. And thanks everyone for your attention.
Thanks very much for having me, and thanks for coming.
Thank
Good
you.
luck.
Thank you.
Cheers, man. Bye.
Thank you.